Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Tanujja Dadlani, a research analyst at ISAS, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today we have with us Dr. Ivan, an Asian security and international relations expert who specializes in China-India relations. He's currently a visiting research fellow at ISAS. Welcome, Dr. Ivan.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on the podcast.
On the 13th of June, Israel launched surprise airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military sites, killing key figures. Iran then retaliated with drone and missile attacks. On June 22nd, the United States struck three Iranian nuclear facilities, prompting Iran to target a US base in Qatar. While tensions were high, a fragile ceasefire has since taken hold. Dr. Ivan, can you briefly outline the status of the Iran-Israel-US conflict as it currently stands and its significance on South Asia, particularly India and Pakistan?
Well, the ceasefire holds for now, but there is much which is uncertain. And the war might resume if negotiations fail, and it's not even certain whether there will be negotiations, although this is very likely. Generally speaking, I believe that the conflict was a major Israeli military victory, but the strategic outcome of this conflict still remains uncertain. There are a lot of key questions which are still unclear and uncertain. For example, how much Iran's nuclear program has been destroyed. Obviously, this is kind of a very major question, not only security in terms of security, but also a very much major question in domestic US politics. And then there are questions like how the recent conflict has affected the willingness of the Iranian leadership to produce nuclear weapons, how the changed military balance between Iran and Israel will affect the chances of negotiated peace or alternatively renewed war. So there are many questions. Another, for example, is can the negotiations produce an outcome which is acceptable to the US, Iran, and Israel? And what happens if one of the parties feels that it is not satisfied with a negotiated solution? Even if they accept it formally, they might not actually accept it in reality. So there are many questions which are still very much unclear. I think that what seems to be clear as of now is that the Iranian regime has survived the crisis, and it seems more likely than not that its nuclear program, although very much degraded, has also survived. Which means that some of the fundamental aspects of the whole conflict have remained somewhat similar. And there are very much the similar options facing the US and Israel. One option, of course, would be to wait for regime collapse, which looks unlikely at this point. Another option, the second option, would be to wait for to promote a difficult diplomatic deal, which most likely has become much more complex now as a result of the war because there is so little mutual trust. And then, of course, there is the third option, the military option. But now, after this brief conflict, it has become clear that in order to annihilate the Iranian nuclear program, next time Israel or the US will need a much larger military campaign, which almost certainly will involve a much higher degree of US involvement. So the bottom line is that the fundamental issues, namely Iran's nuclear program and ambitions, have not been resolved. And this means that we are still in a state of great uncertainty. We don't know how this conflict would pan out on the longer run. Now, going back to how this will affect South Asia, I think it will affect it on several levels. Of course, economically, it affects it in terms of energy prices. Although neither India nor Pakistan import a lot of oil from Iran. Actually, India imports none at all. Uh, Probably Pakistani imports illegally some oil from Iran, but it's not a lot. Economically, also, we have to think of things like shipping costs, for example, and insurance. And then on another level, I think that this conflict affected South Asia geopolitically because both India and Pakistan have been trying to strike very difficult balancing acts between Israel and US on one side and Iran, China, and Russia, and in some ways even much of the global South on the other hand. So it has been a difficult kind of balancing act for both countries. And I think we can discuss this a little bit later in further questions. And then, of course, there is the domestic politics dimension. In Pakistan, there is a large Shia minority, and there is a kind of a powerful popular sense of Islamic solidarity. Also, there is the presence of Islamists in politics. All this kind of makes the position of the Pakistani government much more difficult. But also in India, there are domestic politics of the whole issue. And there has been some criticism at the Indian government from the left because of some residual third world solidarity, or kind of because of negative attitudes in some quarters in India toward the US or Israel. And then, of course, there is the evacuation level. Both India and Pakistan have tried to evacuate their nationals in Iran. Especially in the case of India, there have been about 10,000 Indians, even more, in Iran. So the Indian government has made an effort to repatriate them. And also it offered the option of evacuation to Indian nationals in Israel too. And apart from all these issues, we also have to understand that there is what one might call the substantive issue, that is the issue of Iran's nuclear program. So even if you leave the politics of the issue aside, there is the question of Iran's nuclear program. Do India and Pakistan actually want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons? And my sense is that neither of the two countries actually wants such a thing, because it will diminish their nuclear status and it can produce a dangerous chain reaction in the Middle East. And obviously, for Pakistan, this is particularly bad because Pakistan is a neighbor of Iran. So Pakistan will have three nuclear armed neighbors if Iran acquires nuclear weapons. So obviously, it's the substantive issue is also important, and it hasn't been sufficiently discussed in both India or Pakistan, but it's very important for their calculations. Now, if you think about the reactions of both sides, I think that about India, we can say that India's reaction has been, generally speaking, cautious. It has tried to keep a low profile on the issue. New Delhi called for de-escalation and negotiations. It did not back Shanghai Cooperation Organization resolution condemning Israel. So it has, generally speaking, tried to keep a low profile. However, on the other hand, India has reached out to Iran. For example, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar spoke on the phone with Iran's foreign minister, and more importantly, India participated in the BRICS decision to issue a statement describing the Israeli attack as a violation of international law. Which is not the same thing as condemnation. I want to stress this, but it's still much tougher language than initially. So India is essentially trying to keep a careful balance between the two sides. I think that this reflects in some ways the fundamental duality of Indian foreign policy. So on one hand, India is a country that has close ties with the US, with the West, with Israel, and with the US dominated international order. But then on the other hand, India is also member of various clubs which are revisionist in many ways, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS. And these clubs include revisionist powers such as Russia and China and Iran itself. So it's a very tough balancing act for India. And this can be seen in its reaction. When it comes down to Pakistan, Pakistan officially denounced the Israeli attack and joined the condemnation of Israel at various international forums, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. And there were demonstrations in Pakistan against Israel and in support for Iran. However, I think that Islamabad in practice has tried to distance itself from the conflict next door and to refute any claims that it has taken a side or that it is helping either Iran or the US. And of course, one also has to bear in mind that Pakistan's position has been greatly complicated because, as we all know, Marshal Asim Munir and President Trump had a lunch during the crisis, and this has led to various speculations inside Pakistan and outside that Islamabad, or rather Rawalpindi, has played some role in the conflict, that it has offered maybe some type of cooperation with the US, or alternatively, that Marshal Munir has tried to convince President Trump not to participate in the conflict and not to strike Iran. So the optics of this, I believe, for Pakistan are also very important.
Absolutely. You touched on this briefly earlier. India has long balanced its strategic ties with both Israel and Iran. Although India no longer buys oil from Iran, it still has other links with the country, such as its 10-year contract at Iran's Chabahar port. Additionally, India has ties with Israel in defense. How has the escalation tested this balancing act?
Well, India has to walk a very tightrope between Iran on one side and Israel and the US on the other. It's very important to realize that when we are speaking about India's balancing act, we are speaking about a balancing act not just between Iran and Israel, but much more importantly, between Iran and the US. And of course, the US is of enormous importance for India as a key strategic partner, with great importance for India's economic, technological rise, military balance with China, and many, many other issues. So, for this reason, while India has tried to strike a balance, it is very clear that it has leaned toward the US at Iran's expense. And I think that the clearest sign has been the great decline of India-Iran oil trade, and generally speaking, trade over the last couple of years. In 2019, the United States reimposed sanctions on Iran, and you can see how Indo-Iranian trade greatly decreased as a result. I think that in 2019, it was something like $18 billion US dollars. And since then, it has declined to slightly above $2 billion for last year. So obviously, this is enormous decline, which clearly reflects the India's leaning toward the US and the effect of US sanctions. Nevertheless, we also have to bear in mind that Iran is very important for India. The main reason is connectivity, the Chabahar port especially. Last year, as I think you mentioned, India got a 10-year contract to operate and equip the Shahid Beheshti terminal at Chabahar port. This happened, by the way, after more than 2 decades of waiting due to different geopolitical reasons, which practically came down to the US reaction to Indian involvement in the port. Eventually, the US, by the way, gave India a waiver. But for India, one has to understand the Chabahar port is very important because it gives it access to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. And it also enables India to connect with Russia's planned international North Sea transportation corridor, which would give India much easier access to Russia. And also, obviously, the Chabahar port and this whole corridor that India hopes to open to Central Asia, maybe to Russia, is happening in competition with China, and especially with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which has been very much focused in this part of the world on the Gwadar port. So, for India, Iran is truly important. It's also important because of Pakistan, because obviously India needs to have decent relations with Tehran in order to outflank its arch rival Pakistan. While oil is not a major factor right now, one day it might become once again. And of course, we shouldn't forget that for India, another very important thing is relations with the rest of the Middle East and with the global South, much of which is very critical of Israeli behavior. So all this is constraining India's response to the crisis and Indian behavior in it. However, on the other side, we also have to understand that Israel is also very important for India. Israel is a very major defense supplier to India. Its drones and loitering munitions played a very important role during the recent India-Pakistan conflict. Also, the two sides, that is Israel and India, have been co-developing arms. For example, there is a joint facility at Hyderabad which is producing drones. India also has been exporting some of its own arms to Israel, for example, rockets and explosives. But more broadly, I think that also the diplomatic relationship between India and Israel has strengthened over the years. For example, you can see it very clearly during the recent conflict between New Delhi and Islamabad. In comparison to most other countries in the world, Israel actually fully backed India in this conflict, which was very well received in New Delhi. And also, of course, I believe Israel is very important for India because of IMEC, that is India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. So for all these reasons, Israel is very important for India. So in short, India has a very tough balancing act to make. But going back to your original question, I think that the current escalation has very much tested India's policy of balancing, because India has tried not to antagonize either side of the conflict and keep a low profile and call for de-escalation. However, this is very difficult position to be in. By the way, there are clear similarities between the current crisis, or the recent rather crisis between Israel and Iran and India's behavior. Well, there are clearly similarities between India's behavior in the recent crisis between Iran and Israel and India's behavior during the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the conflict that is still ongoing. This in some ways reflects the fundamental dilemma of India's strategy of multi-alignment. Multi-alignment works very well when things are stable and it's easy to cooperate with different world powers. However, when conflicts erupts, the pressure to choose one side grows, and this pulls India in different directions, making a balanced, multi-aligned position much more difficult. And the result is that often India's partners are disappointed with its position. However, on the more positive side for New Delhi, they are not very angry. I think that this is roughly what is happening right now with Iran and Israel and the US. But of course, one also has to bear in mind that India was very fortunate that the conflict was relatively brief. There was not enough time for substantial pressure to build on New Delhi. And also, I think that there was not sufficient time for all sides, the US, Israel, and Iran, to focus on important third parties such as India. In many ways, the drama of the conflict drew attention away from India's careful balancing act. So, in a certain sense, I believe that India was very fortunate in this. However, if there is a renewal of the conflict, India might find it much more difficult to balance in this way.
Moving to Pakistan, in January 2024, Pakistan and Iran fired missiles into each other's territory. However, Pakistan recently condemned Iran's violated sovereignty during these attacks. Given Pakistan's complicated ties with Iran, do you feel Pakistan engaged in hedging during this conflict and will continue to do so given its multi-layered relationship with the United States?
Thank you. I believe that Pakistan is also having a very fine balancing act to make, or hedging act, if you prefer. Although I think that its balancing act is very different from New Delhi's. The balance in the case of Pakistan is between the US on one side and domestic public opinion and Iran to the other. So Pakistan is also in a very difficult position because it cannot be seen to publicly abandon Iran for Israel and the US. That's because of public opinion in the country, which is extremely negative toward Israel and also somewhat negative toward the US. Also, because there is a very large Shia minority in Pakistan, we have to bear in mind that between 15 and 20% of Pakistan's population are Shia, who regard Iran as their spiritual center very often. And then, of course, and there is the sense of Muslim solidarity. And another factor, I believe, in Pakistan's balancing act is that Pakistan is afraid of potential Iranian retaliation, especially if Iran decides to support Baloch separatists against the Pakistani state. And there are also other considerations. For example, the energy supply of the Gwadar port comes from Iran. And by the way, during the recent conflict, it stopped for briefly. Maybe a message that Iran wanted to send to Pakistan. What will happen if it decides to side with the US and with Israel? So Pakistan is in a very difficult position. Also, we have to bear in mind that last year there was a major flare-up between the two countries, which even further complicated things. Iran attacked Pakistani-based Sunni Bawach separatist groups, which operated on Pakistani territory, specifically the group Jaish al-Adl. And this happened at the time of fighting with tensions with Israel. Uh, and later, Rawalpindi responded to Iranian actions. So there was kind of a brief military crisis exchange of strikes between Iran and Pakistan. Later, they reconciled, but many analysts viewed the Iranian strikes as a sort of warning against Pakistan. What will happen if it decides to support US efforts against Tehran and host anti-Iranian groups? Later, the same year, 2024, the two sides actually reconciled, and they even conducted joint operations against the Bawach, the Bawach Sunni groups on in their borderlands. Reportedly, they even killed the leader of Jaish al-Adl. But so this is on one side of the equation for Pakistan. But then on the other side of the equation for Pakistan and for Pakistan's careful balancing act, Islamabad needs to really rebuild its relationship with Washington, which has been improving in the last months. Pakistan obviously needs financial support from the US and from US dominated international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund. Very importantly, the Pakistani military needs spare parts for its US equipment from Washington. I think that both Islamabad and Washington also want to make sure that Pakistan doesn't become excessively reliant on China. So, for all these reasons, Pakistan needs to make sure that it has a good relationship with the US and that it continues improving this relationship. And here, by the way, it's once again important to draw attention to the bad optics of Field Marshal Asim Munir's lunch with Donald Trump recently. I think that this put the Pakistani government in a much more difficult position. So I think that this made their balancing act between their own public opinion and Iran on one side and Washington on the other much more difficult. So I think that they are also very happy right now that the conflict has at least temporarily come to an end, and that the public pressure and the public pressure on Pakistan and the international pressure on Pakistan have decreased.
Earlier, you mentioned India and Iran's economic ties. If tensions escalate again, how might India's relationship with Iran evolve vis-a-vis its economic relationships at forums like BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO?
Well, I believe that much depends on what type of escalation we are talking about. Because, well, we have to think, will this escalation involve Israel and Iran, or will it also involve the United States? And if the United States participates in such an escalation, will it conduct limited strikes as it did last time? Or is it going to choose a larger military campaign? And of course, one can imagine also an American campaign in which the goal is regime change, which of course would be a much more massive military campaign. So very much things depend on what type of escalation we're speaking about. Also, of course, how long this escalation will be. The recent conflict was relatively brief. It was just 12 days. However, if the conflict reignites again, either soon or after a couple of months, because the negotiation process has not yielded a result, then we can imagine a much longer conflict that goes for weeks, maybe even for months. And so all this complicates very much India's position. So all this being said, in this difficult balancing act would probably become much harder in a case of a new escalation. Pressure to take a clearer position will likely grow. the US might pressure India much more decisively next time to take a clear position, which of course would be an anti-Iranian position. That's what the US wants. Also, probably India will find it much more difficult to keep a low profile in organizations such as the SCO and BRICS, which include Iran and which, very broadly speaking, tend to be critical of US and Israel. This is particularly true, by the way, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is dominated by China and Russia. And if India refrains from condemning Israel and the US at the SCO, one can imagine great questions emerging about India's position in this organization. So India will be in a very, very tough spot. Also, India has to think of its relations with different Persian Gulf countries which might be involved in the conflict. So essentially, a new conflict will put India's multi-alignment, which we already discussed, in much, much sharper relief and will make it much more difficult to operationalize. It will be politically similar to India's recent ordeal during the recent conflict, but it will be just tougher. And of course, one has to think of the economic impact of a new escalation. The recent conflict produced a relatively limited impact on India, but a new one will present it with a lot of uncertainties. Of course, one aspect would be energy prices, but another aspect will be shipping, for example. Shipping will likely become more expensive. Insurance will become more expensive. If there is a disruption of traffic in the Persian Gulf or in the Red Sea or in the northern Indian Ocean, which are all possibilities, then India will be in a much more difficult position because all these sea routes are very important for India and they are very critical for India's imports. So there will be very serious economic consequences. And of course, this will impact consumer prices in India. And of course, if consumer prices rise, one can imagine substantial domestic political ramifications for this. And then one has to also bear in mind gold. As we all know, Indians have a love affair, so to speak, with gold. And in case of crisis, people very often choose to buy gold as a safe haven. During the recent crisis, gold prices went up. And I think that in a new crisis, probably they might go up even further. Another aspect that we can think of in a new escalation would be air travel. Air travel was already disrupted during the India-Pakistan conflict, and more recently it was disrupted, of course, during the Israel-Iran conflict. So a new escalation will put even further pressure on Indian travelers. And finally, I think that this hasn't been sufficiently featured in the discussion about the recent conflict. India has to always think about its huge community of nationals living in the Gulf. Their lives might be disrupted. Of course, their remittances, the flow of remittances going back to India might be disrupted. Some of these people might lose their jobs or might decide to return home. So, in a case of new escalation, things can get very, very ugly for India. Also, India might be faced with a major evacuation crisis from the Gulf. So, a new escalation will be very unfortunate development for India, both for political and potentially for economic reasons.
Given US aid cuts recently, could Pakistan attempt to leverage the recent crisis to reset or improve its ties with Washington, particularly if the US seeks regional support to justify its actions so far or possibly its involvement in the future?
Well, there is already a reset going on between the US and Pakistan for a lot of reasons. One reason is very successful Pakistani courtship of Donald Trump and the circle around him. Also, Pakistan has promoted various initiatives related to rare earth or cryptocurrency, which has greatly improved its standing in Washington, especially with the Trump administration. And of course, there are also other aspects of the US Pakistan relationship, such as counterterrorism cooperation. I think that also one has to understand that Washington and Islamabad are united in their need to reduce a little bit Pakistan's dependence on China, because I think that both sides are very worried about it. So, for all these reasons, I think that there has been a reset already in U.S.-Pakistani relations. This being said, I believe that the recent crisis will accelerate this reset, because it will increase Pakistan's importance for the United States, because Pakistan is obviously a very important neighbor of Iran, and its strategic value is substantial. And one also has to bear in mind that Pakistan has a lot to offer to the United States. Pakistan can offer Washington intelligence cooperation, especially in the eastern and inland parts of Iran, which are much more difficult for the US and Israel to monitor. How far, of course, such intelligence cooperation can go is an open question, due to the great sensitivity of the issue, the fact that there are very few facts that we know about on this, and obviously Pakistan is afraid also of potential Iranian retaliation. But we also have to bear in mind that Pakistan also can offer Washington a means to increase the economic pressure on Iran. Tellingly, Islamabad closed its 5 border crossing into Iran roughly around the time of Marshal Munir's meeting with Donald Trump, which probably was meant to send a signal to Washington that Pakistan can be very useful in U.S. campaign of economic pressure on Iran. Also, very importantly, Pakistan can reduce the profitable smuggling of Iranian oil to other markets or to its own market. But of course, much is unclear about how much the Pakistani government and military can really crack down on border smuggling, which is completely illegal. This comes down to issues such as the capacity of the Pakistani state, and also one has to bear in mind that the Iran-Pakistan border is very long and very porous. So there are also limits to how much Pakistan can put economic pressure on Iran, but at the very least, it can make Iran's economic situation more difficult than it is. And this is obviously very attractive to the US and to Israel.
Dr. Ivan, how do you foresee over the next 6 months the ramifications of this conflict might pan out for India and Pakistan, respectively?
Okay, I mean, to be entirely honest, I think it's very difficult to predict the future dynamics of the Middle East. And obviously, President Trump is also an actor who is highly unpredictable. So when you combine the two, it's very, very difficult to predict the future. But I think that most likely the coming months would be complex and tense, because the two sides would be oscillating between negotiations on one hand and the very real possibility of renewed conflict on the other. And also, I think that it's very important to remember the domestic politics in all three countries. For example, in Iran, the recent conflict might have some impact on the major question of the succession of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And in the US, of course, we've got well, the complex debate about the US strikes between Democrats and Republicans, but also we have to bear in mind that there is a very major debate in Washington between hawks, some of who want regime change in Iran, and restrainers who believe that the United States should not be involved in another conflict in the Middle East. So I believe that a period of great uncertainty awaits us in the coming months, unless, of course, there is very fast a nuclear deal. Maybe there has been some understanding between the U.S. and Iran. Maybe there have already been some proposals and secret negotiations. So there is much we don't know. But based on what we know now, it seems that a deal is not close, and there will be a prolonged period of uncertainty. Now, the big question, of course, is how all this will affect South Asia. And I think that the impact on South Asia can be taught on several levels. First, I think that both India and Pakistan's balancing acts will continue, and they are likely to keep a relatively low profile on the whole Iran issue. And then another effect, I believe, on South Asia will be that Pakistan's strategic importance for the US will continue to grow. And while there are some problems in the Washington-Islamabad relationship, for example, Pakistan's development of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in general, I think the relationship is going to grow. This means that the Pakistan factor in US-India relations will also continue to grow, and it will become highly negative. It has always been highly negative, but its impact over time will increase. And one has to bear in mind that the last couple of years in US Indian relations have been relatively good to some extent because the Pakistan factor receded. So its reemergence will probably greatly complicate the Washington-New Delhi relationship. And you saw, by the way, a small preview of this during the lunch between Marshal Asim Munir and President Trump. Now, a third potential impact of this uncertainty on South Asia will be that the economic growth in South Asian countries, but especially in India, might be somewhat affected by continued uncertainty. We have to bear in mind that India, while growing relatively well compared to other major economies, is not having a very good year. Initially, growth for this year was projected to be above 7%, and now the projections have fallen to 6.3, 6.5% of growth for this year. And that was all, by the way, before the June crisis between Israel and Iran. So it's possible that growth in India might fall further, and this creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of problems for India. Of course, if there is renewed conflict, things can get even uglier for the Indian economy. But even if there is no conflict, the very uncertainty that the possibility of a new conflict creates might have an impact on the Indian economy and might drive up a little bit costs of oil, of shipping, of insurance, of air travel, these type of things. Finally, I think that another effect of the uncertainty about the future of the another effect that the uncertainty in the Middle East will have on South Asia will be the continued US focus on the Middle East. For Pakistan, of course, this is very good because it will increase its strategic value. But for India, I think it will be mostly negative. Of course, for India, kind of US focus on the Middle East will have some positives. For example, it might slightly reduce US pressure on India in their tough trade negotiations. But in general, I think it will be negative because it will distract the US from the Indo-Pacific and from countering China. And for New Delhi, this is very bad because it will reduce its strategic importance for Washington and it will undermine India's own position vis-a-vis China. So I believe that US focus on the Middle East will have much greater negatives than positives for India. So that's my assessment how the coming months of uncertainty, likely uncertainty in the Middle East will affect South Asia.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Ivan, and thank you for the insight. You have been listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at iss.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.